So I'm Emily Lovell. I'm a postdoc. I'm funded by our open source program office in the just started the second year of my postdoc. And I am actually quite delighted to introduce you to Tom Callaway, also known as Spot, who is a principal open source strategist. There we go. Thank you for putting your title on your slide, at AWS. And I've known Spot for, I think, some number of years now.
Yes.
Actually.
More than either of us probably care to admit.
Yeah, more than we probably care to admit. But Spot's like kind of the reason I got pulled into open source. Like being at a conference, I was doing computing education work, teaching in different areas, and Spot and one of his colleagues at Red Hat at the time kind of said, hey, like, why don't you come think about doing this professional development workshop to teach open source? I was a grad student at the time, but actually through that working group, I accidentally got a tenure track position before I finished my PhD. So open source has delivered for me. I got to then develop an open source class through support of those workshops that were happening. And at the time you were doing university program work at Red Hat. So anyway, none of this was prepared. I just jumped up here. But I think that's all really just to the point that I can't think of anybody better to be talking on the subject of relationships between universities and open source communities, because Spot has this really unique perspective from having worked with universities and being in industry. So he's the person I go to whenever I have questions about the real world out there. And I'm excited to hear what you have in mind for us.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
Hi. So that was fantastic. That was really cool. It's always fun to hear what other people think about you. So I have a very short agenda for today. I will try and keep it in time, but I have lots of things that are in my brain, and I apologize in advance if I go over. Disclaimer, because I have to get that out of the way as a corporate shill. I work for a small startup out of Seattle that is doing this new thing called Cloud. I don't know if you've heard of it. I'm not speaking on behalf of them today. These are my opinions, so please don't go rush to tell the press that AWS is doing something fantastic when they're not. I work on a team called Open Source Strategy and Marketing. They named that team that specifically so that our acronym could be awesome and we could refer to ourselves as awesome all the time. My role is as a principal open source strategist. What that functionally means is that I help groups build practical strategy around open source, whether that's the use of, the contribution to, or the creation of new open source. I also work with open source communities to help them be more sustainable. Obviously, AWS has a vested interest in having the open source communities that it depends on and that its customers depend on continue to be there and be healthy. So one of the things that I heard last night that I threw into my deck last night was this concept of open scholarship that I had never really been exposed to before. And I love this idea. And I wanted to start off by pointing out that open source is fundamentally open scholarship, applied to a different space perhaps, but the same core concepts are there. The right to use, the right to modify, the right to redistribute, the acts of being transparent and the acts of being collaborative and building communities around. These apply universally to both open source and open scholarship. So I would encourage you, as you're listening to my very software-centric talk, to mentally replace open scholarship with open source if it helps you to follow along and you're not a software person. Now, one of the things that I teach as my very first step when I'm talking with teams about open source from a strategy perspective is that open source is more than a license. A lot of people spend a lot of time getting very hung up over what is the right open source license to make this work successful. And that's not really the right set of questions to be starting with. Yes, the license is very important because it provides the framework that allows us to have the permissions that we want to be able to be doing open source, to be openly collaborating, to be transparently working together, to have that right to remix that copyright doesn't give us by default. That license is that clever hack that allows us to do these things. But open source is people, fundamentally. It is bringing people together to solve a problem or to tackle a challenge or to just collaborate more broadly. And without people, open source is worthless. No amount of code uploaded to GitHub is going to replace the people that built it. No amount of effort in technological advancement is going to change the fact that someone has to be creative on the other end of that to make it do a thing. And so understanding the value that you get from people is infinitely more important than hyper-focusing around the licensing aspects of open source. So I will not be talking about licensing anymore throughout any of this material. It will all be in the lens of people as open source. Now, I want to call out that academia and open source are not always friends. This is a case from University of Minnesota. This is a published paper called "On the Feasibility of Stealthily Introducing Vulnerabilities in Open Source Software via Hypocrite Commits," where a group of researchers at the University of Minnesota were submitting changes to the upstream Linux kernel that they knew to be vulnerable. They were doing this intentionally to try to see who would notice. And then they wrote a paper about this and said, look at all the things you didn't notice, ha ha ha, we were sneaky. Obviously, the Linux kernel community didn't take this very well because there were people on the other end of that engagement, and they felt that their trust had been deeply abused because the idea behind the Linux kernel community is that people are genuinely trying to, in good faith, contribute things that will not make it worse. They're trying to make it better. They're trying to fix bugs. They're trying to add features. They're not expecting academic research students to be submitting vulnerabilities to the environment. And they called these people out on it from the Linux kernel community, and they said, hey, you need to stop this. This is not cool. And they basically said, yeah, sure, whatever. And then continued to do it after this paper was published. They started again submitting more patches that had clear vulnerabilities. And the net result of this was that the University of Minnesota is now banned from contributing to the Linux kernel. Now, their internal review board investigated this and determined that it was not a violation of their standards of ethics for them to actively do security penetration research on a live open source community. I disagree with that vehemently, but I also am not that ethics board, so I don't get a vote. But I do think that it becomes a challenge when this is the way that academia chooses to engage in open source communities. It has a chilling effect. And so I'm not going to harp on this, but I wanted to call it out and make sure that everyone understands that sometimes what seems like a good idea in a research context, when attempted to apply to a real world open source community of humans, does not balance out. There are very different perspectives on this problem. What I'm going to mostly talk about today is sustainability, a concept that we have not mentioned at all today. No, I'm just kidding. It's what we've been all talking about all day. But I wanted to start with some definitions, so we were working from a sort of constant set of terminology. The Cambridge Dictionary defines sustainability in a non-ecological context. It took me quite a while to find a dictionary that was not just referring to it as things you shouldn't do to destroy the planet, but the quality of being able to continue over a period of time. And I think that's right. I think that's the high level definition of sustainability that we're all sort of talking about here. But I wanted to go a step farther and define open source sustainability. And this is something that not a lot of people have done. I was really hoping I would be able to find like an established, this is what open source sustainability is. So this is my take at it. Sustainability is the quality of an open source project that has the necessary resources, human, technological, logistical, and financial, to regularly release code and content, to have a diverse and growing user and contributor base, to address and resolve bugs in a responsive manner, and to encourage and include external non-maintainer contributions, all while minimizing single points of failure. So if you're doing all of these things, you're probably a very sustainable open source project. If you're doing some of these things, you're on the path towards sustainability. We could probably have an entire hour-long session where we argue the merits of my points, but for the purposes of me being up here and you being over there, I'm going to ask that we just sort of accept this definition and continue. Now, I don't think that anyone who is working in open source believes that open source does not have a sustainability problem. This is the TokenX KCD slide that is required in any good tech industry presentation. This is 2347, which points out that all modern digital infrastructure is based on a project that some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. Now, sometimes people look at this and they go, ha ha ha, that's really funny. That's not how it works in the real world. But I'm here to tell you from the real world, that is absolutely how it works in the real world. 110%. Log4j proved this. When the Log4j vulnerabilities were discovered, overnight, everyone discovered that they had Log4j in their environment. People who didn't even know they had Java in their environment discovered they had Log4j in their environment. Amazon, which is a huge Java shop, discovered that almost every one of its Java-based services that we were offering had Log4j inside of it. And none of those teams had indicated that Log4j was part of their core dependencies because it was an invisible dependency that was buried inside of the stack. Someone at some point decided, hey, my app needs to do logging. Or, hey, my library should log this output, and I'm just going to use this standardized mechanism for logging, and it just got inherited. And a lot of our apps, they had multiple copies at multiple versions of Log4j. It was actually easier for Amazon's Java team to write code that would hot patch in memory out the Log4j vulnerability than it was for us to identify all the places that we had Log4j in our environment. We actually released that tool as open source if you still have the Log4j problem. Okay, so there's another case here that's not often as talked about, and this is the case of LeftPad. I don't know how many people remember what happened with LeftPad, but LeftPad was literally a 10-line piece of JavaScript that padded your code a certain amount on the left side. And at one point, the maintainer decided that, for a variety of reasons, I'm not going to get into the full story, but he decided that he was done with open source. He'd had enough of this nonsense, and he was going to take his code and go home. And he deleted all of his packages from NPM. And LeftPad was one of them, this little 10-line thing of code. And in this window of time in which LeftPad disappeared from the internet, which was roughly about 3 hours, most of the internet stopped working. Almost certainly none of the people building core applications were consciously choosing LeftPad as a core dependency for their app, for their web applications, for their JavaScript applications. But nevertheless, enough core dependencies did that its removal stopped everything that was dependent on that chain from working. So it is really easy to kick that little tiny block out in this picture and have everything shut down and stop. Now I'm going to give you more data points to really illustrate how these can be single points of failure. In 2014, a study found that 93% of NPM packages had only one maintainer. So very easy single point of failure. We used to say got hit by a bus. We don't like that. It's hits a little too close to home. Now we say got eaten by raptors because that's unlikely to happen, but it still gets the point across. And then another study came back in 2022. A friend of mine who was doing this from a security perspective looked at all the NPM releases that had ever been done, not just individual packages, but the number of releases that had ever come out of NPM. 64% of those releases were done by a single person. So very clearly, this is an environment that has very few people holding up key legs of it. And it's not just NPM, it's not just Node, it's not just JavaScript. If you look at PyPy, in 2019, they determined that 85.22% of PyPy packages had a single author. And then more broadly, if you look at GitHub across the board, you see that almost 50% of contributors only contributed once across popular projects on GitHub. It's very hard to get ownership data out of GitHub because it's hidden. We can't easily get that out of GitHub, so it's harder for me to get a stat that says, well, this is how many single maintainer projects there are in GitHub. But based on what we see from the language ecosystems, we think it's highly likely that the numbers are somewhere in the high 60 to 80% range for these environments. R has the same problem. Go has the same problem. Rust has the same problem. None of these ecosystems are immune from the sustainability problem, from this single point of failure problem. Tidelift has been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to help. open source maintainers in this regard. They do a lengthy survey where they ask open source maintainers, people who are known to be open source maintainers. They ask them a lot of different questions and get a lot of really useful data. One of the questions they asked that I thought was telling was, if you were offered non-financial support for your projects, how valuable would each of the following types of help, guidance, and resources be in making your life as a maintainer easier? Obviously, money is the biggest and most obvious thing that could be put into play in a lot of these scenarios to help. Money's not a magic thing. We were talking about that earlier. But if we take money off the table and we say, look, money is not something that we have available, what else could we do that would help you out? And these are some of the things that they called out. They called out improving the experience for users and contributors, improving the documentation. Marketing the project was the third most popular thing that they wanted help with, which speaks to the sustainability problem, that they want their software to be useful. They know it could be more useful and they don't know how to get it there. They want the software to be understood. They know they don't have the documentation to help it be understood. They would like some help getting it there. And they want people to know what they are doing at a high level. They want people to know they exist. If you feel unappreciated, if you feel misunderstood, if you feel that your software is not living up to the full potential that you can foresee for it because you have resource constraints upon you, you are very likely to burn out. And this is what we see happening time and time again in open source projects, is that we have these scenarios where they are single points of failure, single points of human failure. And these people are working, they're not getting the respect, they're not getting appreciation, they're not getting the money, they're not getting the time, they're not getting the ability to fully realize the vision they have for this project, and they don't even really know who's using it. And eventually it all just comes to a head and they say, why am I doing this? I should stop. And then they stop and the internet falls over. So the rest of my talk is really sort of to give this concept of, okay, we know this problem exists. I've quantified it. What could universities do to help? Now, universities aren't a magic solution to this. I'm not trying to oversell the value of what a university could be in this relationship, but I'm going to sort of suggest some things based on my experience that I think might be possibilities. I see these out there to the universe in the hopes that some of them might fall on interested ears and uninterested OSPOs. And thus the last part of my presentation titled Things That Open Source Communities and Academia Could Do Together. So we're going to start with something that we have. So we're going to start with it's really nothing. This is where many software artifacts and data sets and tools are created in the normal course of research, but their creators often dismiss them. I'm not a developer is the most common thing that I hear from educators when I talk to them. And I say, that's garbage. You've just written an entire R library and data set to do this thing. Congratulations, you're a developer. Hate to be the person to have to tell you that. But they often say, no, I'm not a developer. I just did this to simplify my life, to make my research easier, to get me from point A to point B. The code isn't clean. It really only works for me. I don't want anybody else to see this. It's just a hot mess. And no, I can't. I couldn't. No, this isn't, you shouldn't. I didn't make that. All right, so let's take that and let's figure out what we do with that scenario. How do we go from that little fish to this big fish? My suggestion is that we celebrate and share as a first step. Find ways to celebrate these works. They have value. I love what was talked about in the earlier keynote where we sort of talk about the incentive structure and how we can recognize these sorts of things and reward them for researchers. A university OSPO can and should be recognizing and supporting all of these efforts. It starts really simple. If your OSPO could just send out a monthly email of all of the things that you've seen your researchers create in code and data set artifacts, one sentence about each of them going out is enough. It's a start. Yeah, you can do way more than that, but start small and grow from it. Remember to teach that perfect is the enemy of good. It is infinitely better to have code out there, even if it's thrown in a tarball or on a GitHub thing, which I don't recommend. But buried on a hard drive in your office is the worst thing that you could do to that. Most modern languages have these packaging ecosystems. If you're writing in a modern language, you can put it into that packaging ecosystem. You can have it live there. Is there a community around this that you can tap into? If you're already in a specific area, if you're doing, biology research, there's a lot of these communities that already exist around this environment where they would be happy to take your data set. They'll be happy to help you package these things in there. The OSPO can act as that connecting tissue to say, here, you've written this really cool thing and you've made this cool data set. We're going to show you how to convert it into a format that R understands, and we're going to show you how to get it into their packaging ecosystem so that it's really easy for someone else who has the same interest to pull that data set down and start working with it, or to pull your little tool down, or to pull your library down, or to pull whatever artifact it is that you've built down and to start to consume it. And okay, so your thing isn't perfect. You know that things are missing. Make a to-do file and write them all down, all the things that your thing doesn't do that you would like to have cleaned up. You don't have to be the one as the person who wrote the code to do them. Yes, it would be nice if you did, but you don't have to be. These are fantastic student projects. When you spell them out, all the things that could be cleaned up and highlighted and improved, the documentation is missing entirely. Okay, great. You wrote it down. Someone else can see that, and it becomes a very clear step for someone who's trying to figure out what to do. The number one thing that I get asked by students when I talk to students is, how do I get started in open source? Over and over again, I'm so tired of that question. How do I get started in open source? Because the answer is, it depends. But if you've got a to-do file and a thing that your research, your advisor made this thing for their research, and they know they have a to-do file in their research in the GitHub repo, and they can say, hey, I got 6 things in there you can try and do. It's a great answer, and it ties directly back into that relationship that you already have in the academic structure. All right, so let's start with controlled experimentation around open source. Academia does enable this opportunity where you can take open source and test hypotheses on it. I think I can make this faster. I think I can use this to do another thing. Students can be guided through this process. They mentor, they work in groups. It's a very predictable model for using open source, is to take a piece of code, especially in computer science, start poking it and tweaking it, making changes to it and seeing what happens and understanding what we get out of that. You iterate it over time, you refine it, you optimize, you publish. Open source projects don't work like that. Very rarely do they work like that. They're very haphazard. Something that seems like a good idea just gets merged until we discover that things are broken on the other end. And we go, oh, we probably ought to revert that change, or we ought to fix that bug. Sometimes if you're lucky, you have a test infrastructure that catches it early, but it's kind of more of a free-for-all in a lot of open source projects. It's not so much we're going to iterate and measure and test and improve and do that over time. It's very much we're hitting it with a hammer and see what falls off. So my suggestion would be to go beyond publication and say things like, is there a way to get the results of the research included directly into the upstream project? We started playing with this code, we're changing it, environmenting it, but is there a way that we can continue to follow through with that? And not just say, well, I've made this horrible 3-headed beast out of what was once my house cat, and I've uploaded the 3-headed beast to GitHub, and that's all I'm going to do. Can you do it in a way that the upstream is likely to accept? And I know that in a lot of these places where you see things like, well, I took this code and I made it do this other interesting thing, but I really did it as a dirty hack. Or it really assumes that you understand the nature of the universe in quantum physics. And if you are not a PhD in quantum physics, you have no capacity to begin to understand what I did to FFmpeg. Okay, sure, whatever, fine. But you could write documentation that would help that upstream be able to take that would help them be able to maintain this beyond you. Published forks are better than nothing. Don't get me wrong. I'd still rather have that 3-headed cat on GitHub. But upstreams are not going to take the initiative to go hunt these forks down and figure out what could be merged. Something that universities and university OSPOs could do to go above and beyond is to be aware of these things, work with these folks, and get those changes merged back into the upstream so that they can live on in a sustainable way. Access to resources. Yeah, okay, so I'm not trying to crack a joke here. I'm not insinuating that you're gonna show up with a giant bag of money and give it to the open source projects. That's what my employer is supposed to be doing. But academia does have people and time. And this is something that open source lacks in significant quantity. And the open source projects that are out there often struggle to tackle these sort of bigger challenges that require larger teams of people, extensively long efforts, or specialized equipment. And if I ask what universities have, well, they have teams of people. They work on a timescale that's vastly different from open source, and they often have a lot of specialized equipment that I don't have access to. Figuring out how to tie these together makes a lot of sense. is very simple. Encourage academic contributions. One of the things that I know works for my experiences is that work in open source teaches students how to do collaborative development in a way that no group project ever will. It teaches them how to understand and improve other people's code in a way that no sample will ever do. And it doesn't need to be limited to code. Improving documentation, improving design, these things are incredibly valuable to open source, you know? And then looking at a field of study, an area of research, an area of specialization within a university, how can the unique areas of focus that you have bring value to an existing project? Your unique experiences, your unique access to resources, your talents. And keeping in mind that I'm not just talking about students here, I'm also talking about educators, I'm talking about researchers, I'm talking about every level of the academic system can contribute to projects too. Now, I'm not asking for people to suddenly jump up and say, well, I have a 15-minute spare time, I'm happy to go maintain the Linux kernel. But every useful contribution helps a project be more sustainable. A student alone may not be able to do more than one, but a class, a college, the whole UC system, these applied at scale can impact the sustainability of a project in a meaningful way, but it starts with one student doing one contribution. Usability and user experience. Lots of schools have HCI, UI, UX programs, courses, either part of CS or as their own major. The purpose of these courses is fundamentally to teach students how to build and improve experiences so that people have a positive and successful experience using software tools. Cross the streams, people. Find these folks that are in your system already and bring them to the table. Identify open source projects and analyze them from a UI UX perspective. What suggestions do students have looking at these projects with fresh eyes? Encourage them to go beyond hypotheticals and create new mock-ups and then suggest them upstream. If they're comfortable, you know, go as far as you can. I'm pushing you to go very far, but it's not limited to code. Could the website be more friendly? Could the documentation be more useful? This is the number one thing that open source maintainers wish they had besides cache. And universities are incredibly well positioned to do this, and they don't. Can you count the number of times that the CS department has talked to the UI UX, the HCI department? I mean, yeah, you might meet for lunch every now and then, but how many actual meaningful collaborations are happening? I've been bringing this up for almost 10 years, and the most common answer is, oh, we just don't do that. Start doing that. The single paper code drop. Now, we should still encourage and recognize when a published paper comes with open source code. I'm not saying we shouldn't. This is an important step towards reproducibility, and you want to build a culture in your institution that encourages this. You're not going to get to all the other things I want you to get to if you don't start with this simple thing, but you can't stop there. Community building is that next step. Ask questions like, could this code be the seed of a new project? Could it be combined with other existing work to make the other work and your work result in a stronger third work? There's a proud tradition of open source efforts starting in academia, but communities do not spontaneously build themselves. This is fantastic work for an academic OSPO. This is one of the core things that I think an academic OSPO ought to be responsible for. Finding a proper home for it. Maybe it's GitHub, maybe it's somewhere else, but putting it in a home that's not just an academic web page. University websites age really poorly. The number of times I've been trying to do some sort of, you know, open source archaeological dig and finding that the original source was uploaded to Usenet. Well, great, good luck with that. It's even worse when it's a URL that doesn't resolve and the Internet Archive hasn't archived, and I'm just out of luck. Trying to figure out the original license on one piece of code that was uploaded to a dead Usenet server that no longer exists and hasn't existed since 1997 is lots of fun. Is it properly and clearly licensed? I said I wasn't going to talk about licensing, but it's a fact. A lot of stuff that people intend for it to be open source, and they assume that simply uploading it to GitHub accomplishes this somehow. It doesn't. And is it properly licensed both in the paper and in the repo? A very common issue is that the only source of truth we can find for the code's provenance is in the paper. And if the paper didn't bother to list the license that the code was under, then we're back to square one. The code itself wasn't properly licensed. If every paper would simply ensure that the code that is attached to it is the license is described in the paper, that's a huge start. And it's almost never done. Invisible academic open source. If regular open source is hard to find, then academic open source is often invisible. Academic publications are simply not sufficient to market work beyond people who read the paper or people who saw the poster. And we already know how many people are actually reading a lot of what's published in the academic journals. It's not as many as we think. It's always, you know, some, but not as many as we'd hope. And I can tell you how many people in tech are reading academic publications. It's the size of an egg. It looks kind of like this. Maybe at Watson they're doing it. Maybe at Microsoft Research they're doing it. Maybe at Amazon R&D they're doing it. But random tech company, not reading those publications. It's often not even known within the same academic institution. The code work that's being done is invisible. It's hiding behind that big old cloud. So here's my broad, big suggestion is let's create an academic open source conference, like a big one, a proper one that has a journal attached to it with peer review. So we can short circuit all of those existing paths towards tenure for people. And then the goal being to encourage open source in any and all academic fields. The only prerequisite is that your code and data must be open source licensed. If you do these things, congratulations, we'd be happy to have you submit. We'll consider you for this conference. It could kickstart community building across institutions in a way that, you know, otherwise people working in open source don't always have that opportunity to do. It hacks that tenure model and says, we know that the tenure system needs to change, but it's probably going to take 30 years. So in that window of time, we're just going to build this clever hack around it. And we're going to have this thing that has a peer review published journal. And we're going to reprint these things into it. And we're going to have this conference where we bring people together across genres, and we're going to let them present about the interesting work that they've done. And the only commonality but amongst them all is that it's open source in there somewhere. And then when you tell industry, hey, all this open source stuff is happening in one place at one time, would you be interested in sponsoring that? I'm pretty sure you'd be able to convince a couple of those companies to get on board because the sheer sort of gravity that it would bring to the table. Now, yes, I know that putting this together takes a lot of work, but I think that it would be worth it. So those are my big pie in the sky ideas. I'm gonna pause now and take questions. Yes.
I just want to point out that we have a talk tomorrow about that very subject of an open source conference. So I invite you, everyone who's interested in brainstorming about, you know, a proper, as you call it, a proper open source conference. Should attend, should consider it. Is there no questions?
No, I just stared at everybody.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Well, I love the idea, the very last one. Obviously, many of these points resonate. That should be clear. But I love the idea of the academic conference because this has been a clear problem for me and I think many people. It's like, how do you do open source and retrofit yourself to that tenure model that you talked about? And I don't know, maybe it's a selfish feeling, but I feel that the new model is broken because it only focuses people on that one thing. I think perpetuates that one thing then. But yeah, who has the potential to actually organize the conferences? Like, who has the credibility? Obviously the OSPOs, but the OSPOs are still relatively small entities within the university, right? Like our OSPO is a few people, literally. And so, yeah, how do you get over that barrier?
Yeah, so it's a fair question. You know, how do you get that started? I don't want to go too much into what probably ought to be a full BOF on that topic, but I do think that there are existing institutions in academia that are broad, that span across multiple areas of study that could be looked at. Even if you said, hey, we're just going to start with computer science on this because it's a no-brainer, you could bring in someone like the IEEE and have them be meaningfully engaged in helping to create this. It could be something that starts as a UC thing, you know, in its initial stages. I think you don't want to unnecessarily limit scope, but you also don't want to try to create, you know, the universe in one day. So somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer, keeping in mind that it will grow and get bigger over time if you're doing it right. Yes.
Okay, so y'all know I work with students, so my questions are going to be about students. So I'm really curious about kind of 2 points. So you mentioned, like, for instance, having like whole classes or schools contributing to projects. But one of the difficulties of that I've experienced firsthand is that it's really hard to dump like 30 students into one project, and there's just impact to be conscientious about, right? That also requires resources from the community.
Sure.
So I was curious if you could speak a little bit to, like, ideas or anything around how to do that thoughtfully. And then in addition, the other challenge I see is then, like, getting people beyond that first contribution to a project, including students. So when the course ends, like, whether you have any thoughts on, like, how we can better sort of promote continued engagement with projects after the community's invested into these new contributors.
All right, so 2 big questions that probably could be their own talks, but so I think that, the idea of introducing a class to an open source project does have to be done mindfully. You don't want to just dump 30 people who are, blindly poking about and, well-intentioned trouble. And so I think that what I have seen work effectively is when you can first, as an educator, sort of review the community, determine if it is at a maturity state where it can actually be useful to invest in. And then the step 2 is to reach out to the maintainers or maintainer of that community and say, I have 30 students who are interested in working on this project. How would you like us to proceed? Because the answer to that is going to vary project by project. And it's really going to come down to what that person on the other end of the project thinks is valuable. They might say, well, how about you work on this thing together as a group? Or they might say 30 pull requests, bring them. I've seen both. It really depends on the project as to how they interpret that, how they take it. Again, some of these projects would be thrilled to have 30 pull requests come in, even if they're not all completely well structured. You're going to have to sort of read the room and the space to figure out what's the right approach there. Your second item was about
Sustained contributions,
correct.
Engagement.
Thank you. So sustained contributions is a really big challenge. I honestly don't think we should have unreasonable expectations when it comes to students. I think we should expect that while they're in the structure that you've set up for the class or in their environment, when it is in their best interest to do so, they will, and when it's not, they won't. And I think that's, more broadly true across open source. When something, when I have an itch to scratch, I scratched it and I moved on. Sometimes I really liked doing it and I keep doing it and I get engaged in it and I become part of that community. That's fine. And I think that we shouldn't try to make students be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 contributions. Having them do some is enough. And the best that we can hope for is that the experience was good for them, and that for those people who it sparked something, that they understand how they can make that contribution later on. One of the things I really like in this model is identifying students who really do take to this well and bringing them back and having them mentor those other students and say, oh, I remember what my first contribution felt like. And so I look at that as more of a success story in an academic setting than trying to get the students to say, well, you never contributed again. What happened? I never did homework for my physics class again. What happened? Same answer.
So on the topic of, maybe you have talented students, maybe you have, a grad student working on a project that gains popularity. How do you, as a grad student, you see the, the options for you are, I'm ending my college career, or I've been working on this project, like maybe I've got option or offers from like Google or something, but if I go work at Google, I'm going to start working on AdSense, and like this project goes into the oblivion, it's never touched again.
Sure. How
do we show students that there are other options out there? There are other ways to get funding, and maybe this comes as part of an OSPO or something similar. Just like what do you envision for funding projects out of academia?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I think that there's a lot of different approaches that could potentially work there. I think it starts with money, having money, and then figuring out how to reasonably put money in front of these projects and let them know that there's an opportunity for growth. I think incubator programs that say this has potential. We want to give you some funding to continue it beyond what you were planning on doing. Even if you end up going to Google, we would still like to incubate this. We'd like to put some people on it in addition to this. We have some other students that maybe are not as experienced in this tech that want to come up to speed in this, that are willing to put some time in it. Coordinating through the OSPO, coordinating through systems of OSPOs to do this and meaningfully. Are they going to get them all? No. But right now they're not getting any of them in any real sense. And so anything that would be done there would be a net improvement. So yeah, I think that would be an interesting challenge for these OSPOs to try to sort of tackle is what would an incubator model look like for promising programs?
Time for one more.
I'm really curious about kind of your proposal around leveraging HCI, UI, UX communities at schools, basically, as this kind of entry point for, because you're absolutely right. A lot of the time, early entry points into open source is, I built this really complicated, sophisticated, nuanced piece of software, but are you comfortable looking at the terminal and dealing with the database and stuff like that? If not, you're never going to touch it. And so having that interface is crucial. I'm curious to hear kind of really if you've seen examples of that to date, like kind of successful examples of that. But also I'm kind of curious, have you seen things from a media creation pipeline perspective as well? So I know, like, putting generative AI stuff aside for a moment, even just like in terms of image editing and like video editing software, there's a huge open source push just to get parity with internal private publishing software. And so I'm curious if, like, in terms of like, say, films or games departments using kind of open source strategies as well, or kind of, yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential that hasn't been realized in that space. I do know that Rochester Institute of Technology, their open source program, has tapped into this very effectively. Their game, the Magic Institute over there, is their game and design school, and they have very effectively crossed the streams with their open source programs to bring in students from both disciplines to work together on generating and improving. It can start simple as, I made this placeholder graphic for the application that tells you which button to push when, and then improving that, and then having them talk through the workflow. They don't need to understand necessarily the task that's being done, as long as the person who does is in the room, so that they can come up with a proposal on the best way to make it easier for that software and that tooling to be used. And it can start really simple. It can start with things like the web pages. One of the things that has been really impactful over at RIT is they actually had their design students look at open source projects web pages, try to figure out what they were trying to get across, and then reframe that information in a way that was easier to deliver it. Because again, growing a user base is key to sustainability, because contributors come from users. They don't come from thin air. And so anything you can do to make it easier for people to understand the purpose of your software and how to use it is going to be a benefit. So even if you're not actually going in there and actually tearing out the UI of the application itself, there are lots of opportunities for those design, creative-minded students to be able to come in and improve the user experience.
Is it quick? I hate cutting off. All right. I think we're going to have to bring it up. We get the next person. Sorry.
Thank you.